Let's turn now to talking about policy solutions for the pollution problem. Now, one important question is, why would we bother with policy knowing that Coasian bargaining can work under the right circumstances? Well, the reality is that Coasian bargaining is often extremely difficult in practice, because while it may be perfectly possible for us legally to establish property rights, getting the bargaining to happen can be a real difficult issue. After all, this is especially the case if, say, we have a plant that's producing something and it's fused toxins into the atmosphere, and this air in the atmosphere spreads out across a very large area, affecting perhaps millions of people. Trying to get these millions of people all together to bargain with this plant is extremely difficult. Then you make it worse by having there be not just one plant, but multiple plants, and then we have to try to discern exactly how much of the problem is from each plant, and it becomes very, very difficult to solve this problem from a practical standpoint. So that being the case, there's often a call for government to get involved to try to help solve this problem. So there are a number of options that are available. We'll talk about 3 of them. The first one is what we call command and control. Command and control is just what it sounds like. The government issues edicts declaring how much each company can pollute, and then has rather steep penalties if you pollute any more than that. Now, this does have a very obvious benefit in that it does have a very clear, predictable result on pollution. And as far as cutting pollution is costly, we would expect all these companies to just pollute exactly as much as they're allowed to, neither more nor less. So if we have some kind of pollution goal, this will do a reasonably good job getting us there relatively predictably. But there's a potential drawback. To get at that, we need to go a little bit deeper into how companies respond with this kind of situation. So suppose we have these 2 companies, Company A and Company B. Now the reality is that different companies are in fact different when it comes to how difficult or how easy it is for them to cut pollution. So here for Company A, it's relatively difficult, it's very expensive for them to cut pollution. So if here their marginal cost of abatement is $4 million per unit that they cut. While for Company B, it's relatively easy for them to cut pollution, it costs them $1 million for each unit of pollution they cut. Now, before the policy comes into place, each of these companies is producing 4 units of pollution for a total of 8. So then the government steps in and says, we want pollution cut in half, so Company A, you have to slash your 4 down to 2, Company B, you have to slash your 4 down to 2 as well, giving us 4 units of pollution afterward. Now in that case, each company is having to abate 2 units of pollution. But that costs Company A $8 million, Company B $2 million. So it ends up being a total cost of $10 million to get our pollution from 8 units, whatever that happens to be, down to 4 units. Now the problem here, as far as economists are concerned, is that this is not the most cost-effective way to do it. We could cut those 4 units of pollution and do so more cheaply. Just have Company B stop polluting, and you're there. And you do it for $4 million instead of 10. So that's really the difficulty when we have this command and control method, is that it tends to be relatively expensive for the amount of pollution control you're getting. So on the one hand, we have a very clear, predictable result on pollution. On the other hand, we have unnecessarily high abatement costs. So let's turn to a second policy. This one was really designed to try to get around this problem of how do we deal with this abatement cost problem. And really what it comes down to is we have to try to give the company some kind of choice. Is it cheaper for them to abate the pollution, or is it cheaper for them to do something else, to not abate it? Okay. Now the solution here is what we call the pollution tax. It's also called a Pigou tax or a Pigovian tax, or sometimes an emissions charge. These are all different names for the same thing, which really just boils down to, as a company, you can pick to pollute however much you like, but you have to pay for every single unit of pollution that you emit. So there's some kind of tax you have to pay for emitting that pollution. Now the benefit of this we can see in looking at costs. So let's assume there's a $2 million per unit $2 million per unit pollution tax. So the question then each company faces is it better for me to pay the cost of abatement, or better for me to pay the tax? So for Company A, they say, for me to abate costs $4 million apiece. It's better for me just to keep polluting and just pay the tax. So for them, they don't abate at all, so the total cost of abatement is 0. They don't abate. They just pay this $8 million to the government, and the government spends it on something. So really, in the end, it ends up being a wash. Now, in this case, Company B would say, well, it's a $2 million per unit tax, but it only costs us $1 million to abate each unit. So they end up cutting their pollution entirely. Right? So in this case, we got 4 units of pollution abated, all by Company B, and it happened at a total cost of $4 million. And there's no more efficient way for us to do it. The low-cost abater is the one that abated. And that's really the nice benefit to the pollution tax. It provides us with this nice low-cost abatement for the level of abatement that we get. Now, the drawback is that it has an unpredictable effect on pollution levels. If we don't get that tax exactly right, we can end up with more or less pollution than we desire. And we could just imagine if we set that pollution tax extremely high, nobody would pay it, everyone would abate, and we end up cutting pollution far more than was our goal. Or alternatively, if we set the tax too low, nobody ends up abating, everybody just pays the tax, and we don't actually do anything about pollution. Right, so it's very difficult for us to get the tax just right to get the effect of pollution, the effect on pollution levels that we're looking for. That's where cap and trade comes in. Cap and trade is kind of a way to get around these drawbacks. Okay. So the idea here is that the government sets the total pollution level in the country, right, and then either auctions off or issues permits to various polluters up to the total level of pollution that is allowed. Right. And then these permits can be traded. So I could, if I didn't get a permit in the first round, I can go and I can buy it from somebody else. Right. So the idea here is the government has control over the total level, but doesn't have control over who exactly it is creating that pollution. Right. Right. So let's see what effect that has on, say, the costs involved. So let's assume there are 4 permits because the government wants 4 units of pollution. Now the way that we're going to do it here, just to keep life simple, let's say that they just hand 2 permits to each company. So Company A gets 2 permits, Company B gets 2 permits. Okay. But then they can trade among themselves. Well, Company A will say, really these permits are worth $4 million apiece to me, because each permit I have saves me from having to cut a unit of pollution. And cutting a unit of pollution would cost me $4 million. So Company A is willing to pay any price, up to $4 million. Now Company B would be willing to sell as long as they get at least $1 million for that permit. After all, if they get, say, $2 million for it, they can spend $1 million to abate the pollution that now they have to abate, and then there's still $1 million ahead. So as long as the price is somewhere between $1 million and $4 million, there's every reason for Company B just to sell their permits to Company A. So we end up, after all this trading happens, right, Company A has the 4 permits, Company B has none of them, which means Company B has to abate 4 units of pollution, while Company A gets to pollute 4 units. In the end, we end up with 4 units of pollution, exactly what we wanted, and we do it at a cost of $4 million, which is the lowest cost to get to that level of pollution. So we end up with the benefit of, on the one hand, we have control over the pollution level. On the other hand, we have the minimum cost of abatement. Really, this is the best of both worlds when we compare pollution taxes and command and control. We get both benefits. We control the pollution level, and we have a low cost of abatement. So just to overview the various solutions to pollution, we have 4 different possible policies. One is this Coasian Bargaining, this property-based solution. Big benefit there is that it solves the information problem for us, and in some sense it's going to be automatic. Big disadvantage is that bargaining, which is necessary to make this work, isn't always practical. When we look at command and control, the big benefit is that we have a predictable effect on pollution levels. However, we have the information problem again. We don't know that we're picking the right level of pollution. We're not necessarily hitting the social optimum. And at the same time, it's also unnecessarily costly. Now, the pollution tax is basically the reverse of the command and control. We end up with nice low-cost abatement. We have, however, unpredictable effects on the level of pollution. At the same time, we still have that information problem, where once we look at whatever level of pollution we get, we have no way of knowing whether that's the right level or not. It might be too high, it might be too low compared to what is optimal. With cap and trade, we get the benefits from both command and control. We get a predictable effect on pollution levels, we get nice low-cost abatement, but still we have that lingering information problem, where we don't know that we've issued the right number of permits. So it ends up these policy solutions from the government, that information problem is utterly inescapable. Because it's so difficult for us to observe these things, the marginal external cost and the marginal cost of abatement, it's impossible for us to tell whether we have the right level of pollution or not. Right? Whereas with Coasian bargaining, the market would solve that problem for us if we can actually get that to work. Right? So there's a trade-off here. On the one hand, if the market will work, it can actually get us to the optimal level. On the other hand, if for whatever reason it's impossible for us to do that bargaining, the policy has to step in, but we're never quite sure that policy is going to get us to the level we want to be at.